Yeah, I guess I think Robert asked me to well, firstly join his podcast and then join this meeting because of a piece that I had written in Meanjin early this year, and then did an interview with Mick Eight, who I believe many of you know, on his Regenerative Hour, where I was talking about living here in Canberra during the bushfires in summer. The magnificent Brindabellas just over the hills here were on fire. The spectacular old growth forests down the coast towards Bega and Nowra were on fire. And Canberra was blanketed in smoke, smothered in thick, thick smoke, literally for 2 months. We could not breathe, and it was quite apocalyptic, genuinely so. The skies were this deep orange for lengthy periods of the day. You couldn't go outside and breathe properly. You had to stay inside. We had this first go at physical isolation, in a sense, because for a lot of the summer, we just couldn't go outside. And I was sitting at home trying to write about the political climate situation that we were in, and finding it incredibly depressing and incredibly difficult, when a kookaburra in my back garden started laughing. And it was just this moment for me of, there is hope. There is always hope somehow, even in the midst of this. This was this dark orange light coming through in the middle of the morning, and a kookaburra was laughing. And I think a lot of us, I don't know what it's like where you folks are, but a lot of us have been finding at the moment, there's this idea through the pandemic that nature is healing. And I think it can be overstated, the extent to which the natural world's getting a breather at the moment. But there is certainly an aspect of it. And here in Canberra, the bird life, the bird life always in Canberra is lovely, but at the moment it's extraordinary. We've got cockatoos and galahs and gangangs, and a family of 4 yellow-tailed black cockatoos, massive, massive birds just up the hill here that I've been seeing for a while. And the magpies are friendlier than usual. And there is somehow this sense that in crisis there can be hope. And I've been doing a lot of thinking over the last little while about how change happens in politics and how we can get to a better space. and a lot of it comes down to the idea that through crisis there can be hope. That in a sense you need moments of disaster, which are really, I'm not a kind of a revolutionary. I'm not the kind of person who believes that we need to progress disaster in order to make things happen. And disaster, there are terrible things that go with it. And we have to acknowledge, obviously, many people, many animals died in the bushfires. Huge numbers of people are dying at the moment from coronavirus, and the misery is immense. But somehow I think we also need to think about the hope that moments like this can give us, that it's a catalyst for change. And that the change we needs such a catalyst, because it's a very great level of change. So the analysis of politics that I give in this Meanjin piece is that I've increasingly come to this conclusion as somebody who's spent 20 years working in the climate advocacy space, a good many years of that in capital P politics, that our political system as it's currently structured actually is frankly incapable of dealing with the circumstances that we're in. It's not designed in such a way that it can do it. Our system arises from the Enlightenment process, which is a process that's brought us a tremendous amount of good, but it's also disconnected us. It's disconnected us from each other. It's disconnected us from the natural world. It's inculcated in us this belief that I think we think of in politics and we think of in economics, but we've never really thought about it in ourselves. But it's inculcated this belief in separation and dominance, that we are separate from the natural world and that we are dominant over it. We are greater than it. We don't need it. We can extract from it whatever we need. We can dump into it whatever we need, whatever we want, and it'll be fine. It's something over there. And that same analysis goes for so many other things. That same analysis sits behind racial injustice. Absolutely. It sits behind colonialism and white supremacy. This idea that white men are better than and entitled to dominate non-whites. And it absolutely sits behind patriarchy. It sits behind this idea that men and women are fundamentally a binary and different, and that men are superior. And it, of course, sits behind capitalism. It sits behind the idea that everything is countable and everything is exchangeable for money. And that, we can, one of the most blatant things I saw recently, a couple of years ago, there was an analysis done of the value of the Great Barrier Reef, which came out at $52 billion or something astonishingly small like that, frankly, that the value that it brings. Which basically means that, if we can make more than that by destroying it, then not only are we entitled to, but in fact, in our current philosophy, we're actually kind of almost obliged to. So this incredible philosophy of separation and dominance, and along with that, this kind of linearity that underpins so much of our political thinking, which is at its heart anti-ecological thinking. And that's where I'm trying to get to, is trying to bring into this whole process through, ironically, kind of processes that the Enlightenment is bringing us to through scientific analysis. We're getting to this point where we're understanding actually that all these things are not true, that everything is fundamentally interconnected, that everything is interdependent. We are absolutely interdependent with every other aspect of the world around us, and everything is networked. So this linearity needs to be replaced with an idea of networked interdependence. Hi, Mick. Where this plays out in our politics is most obvious, I think, in the adversarial nature of our politics. So if you think about these philosophies of separation and dominance and linearity, what we see in our politics, which quite literally evolves through the medieval periods into the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, out of jousting, out of tournaments, is our adversarial politics is fundamentally based on the idea of two forces butting up against each other and one of them winning. And usually it's by force of strength that one wins. But also what it means is the linearity means that if you can't win, then what you do is you need to compromise on this A to B kind of process, and somewhere in the middle you'll compromise. But that compromise is fundamentally a sign of weakness, and offering compromises is a sign of weakness. So all of these elements to our politics, to me, mean that we can't get together and discuss creative ideas effectively through this process. Those who currently have power will continue to hold on to power, usually until it's too late. And we can't understand truly through our political systems and respect the fact of interdependence with the natural world. Our political resource for us to use. And until we flip that, and until we start to understand that we cannot live without respecting our fundamental interdependence with the natural world, we're not going to succeed. But the other point that I come to is not only is our political system not well suited to dealing with the problem, but it's actually fundamentally ill suited to enabling us to survive as things get worse, through the ecological crisis, through the health crisis, through the crisis of equity and racial injustice that's spinning out of control in the USA at the moment. This system of dominance and separation and linearity does not help us to build a world which we can survive and thrive in this century as it's coming forward. And so I see this point as this point of crisis where a lot of people are coming to understand that the type of change that we need is a very, very deep change in the way we think about the world, the way we think about each other, the way we think about the natural world, and the way we think about governing ourselves and democracy and how we make decisions together. The other kind of, there's a few interesting ways of kind of looking at that through political theory and also ecological theory that I want to just kind of really briefly touch on in terms of change. And I won't go into very much detail about the politics, but there's, one of the political theorists I go to a lot, Antonio Gramsci, talks about how power is held mostly not through physical force, but through the power of ideas, which he calls common sense, working together with the power of institutions as they're set up. So that can be obvious political institutions like parliaments. It can be through educational institutions, through police forces, obviously, through economic power, through the media, the institution of the media. And it's that combination of the power of the institutions and the power of the common sense that creates what he calls hegemony, which is unchallengeable power, really. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is a lot of people realizing that the political common sense that we've been living under isn't actually common sense, doesn't actually make sense. These ideas are really being challenged a lot. And so the people in power, if they're losing grip on the common sense, what they tend to do is grab hold much, much more firmly to the institutions of power that they have. And I think we're seeing that at the moment. If you look at the way the Murdoch media, for instance, is really grabbing hold of its ideas and trumpeting them more and more desperately, it's fascinating to see that process. If you look at, Scott Morrison blatantly just appointing a bunch of mates from the fossil fuel industry to this COVID commission that he's set up, so that there is no way that it could have done anything else but advise more gas infrastructure, more fossil fuel infrastructure at the moment. The pushing aside of so many democratic norms, the raiding of media by the federal police, there's here in Canberra is quite a big issue, and it's starting to become a national issue of two really important cases of whistleblowers having the book thrown at them in the courts, one from the ATO, one from Department of Foreign Affairs, with the abuse of government power and people trying to shine a light on it and absolutely being stomped on. So many of those basic institutions of democracy are being whittled away because those in power are feeling their grip on the common sense being removed, so they need to hold on to the institutions. And what Gramsci says is that as that starts to happen, you see a moment of collapse. And at that moment of collapse, it's very, very dangerous for a while, but you can build a better way of doing things at these moments. And what I find fascinating is bringing the ecological thinking into this, thinking about the way ecologies change. And again, it's really interesting the way our understanding of ecologies has changed over the last 150 years. Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest, which he didn't really explain in these terms at all, but in the late 19th century, it was very much adopted in terms of might makes right and strength will help you survive. So this social Darwinism idea grew out of that. And we developed this idea of evolution as being fundamentally about competition. More and more recently, we've been learning that actually evolution is at least as much about cooperation as it is about competition. Co-evolution happens all the time. Our evolutionary processes make us fundamentally interdependent with everything else around us. But what I find interesting is that in ecological theory, there's this, not theory, but in the science, there's this process that we see happen all the time, and it happens at very small local levels, and it happens at large bioregional levels, and it happens at massive ecosystem levels, whereby as one part of an ecosystem or one species gets more and more and more and more dominant, it feels like it feels safe for a while as it grows dominant in that ecosystem, but it inevitably leads to collapse. Inevitably. Dominance of one aspect of an ecosystem inevitably leads to ecosystem collapse. And then what happens at that moment is you get this moment of refreshing where there's suddenly new space opens up for new species, new parts of that ecosystem to arise. And I think, we see that obviously, if you're a gardener, you see it when you take out certain plants that are beginning to dominate, and there's suddenly more space. If your mint is going nuts and taking over everything else, you take that out and there's more space in it, in your garden for other things to grow. Right at the other end of the spectrum, you can go to, the last great extinction, when the dinosaurs were wiped out and the dinosaurs had dominated the global ecosystem for so long. And the collapse of so many ecosystems is what created the space for mammals to evolve the way they did, and eventually for humans to evolve. So that kind of process of ecosystem collapse and renewal also really kind of goes to me to the political process. That, in fact, at a moment like this, where we're seeing such certainties for the entirety of my life, and more since the Second World War, the certainty that the USA would be dominant in our politics, starting to collapse, the certainties that our representative democratic system would be stable and safe, and that we'd be able to rely on our parliamentary democracy to get us through, those kinds of things are collapsing. And it's really incumbent on us, I think, to start seriously thinking about, okay, well, if they're already unstable, if they're on their way out, and if they're not really serving us very well anyway, what do we need to do in order to make sure that what comes next is better? And that, to me, is the critical point which Gramsci brings up as he says, at this moment of collapse, what he calls the interregnum, it's a time, as he says kind of poetically, where there are monsters. The risk at a moment like this of heading towards authoritarianism in our politics is very, very obvious, I think. So that kind of all brings me back to this idea of, okay, so what do we do? And it's incumbent on us, I think, to start building the political institutions that we want, building the democratic systems that we believe are going to be the ones that will help us to deal with the crises that we're facing now, prime amongst them, the climate crisis, and the ones that are going to help us not just survive, but actually thrive and have a better life. And they're going to be participatory, deliberative systems where we can come together jointly together to work out a better way of living. They're going to be systems where we respect the natural world, where we respect diversity, where we respect interconnection and social cohesion, and cohesion between us humans and the natural world that we're part of. And they're systems that have to bubble up from the grassroots up. That is, to me, the fundamental reality, both politically but also ecologically, is that at a moment like this, what we need to do is start cultivating these new democratic systems and the practices that we want to see. We need to start cultivating them from the grassroots up. And as we do that, they can come to be evolutionarily suited. They can find their niche so that they can grow really, really effectively into the systems up. And this is one of the wonderful things about looking at ecology, is that you see the way collapse and regrowth happens together. And humans are the first species that actually has the capacity to design that growth, to design the regrowth the way we want it. So yeah, I see that in things like these conversations, as I understand from Robert, you guys coming together to talk about what you can do, to talk about the issues. This is a democratic process. This is people coming together to talk and think about the present and think about the future. I see it in things like community gardens that are springing up all over the place in Australia and around the world, where people can grow their own food. And what happens everywhere, as I see it and as I hear it in community gardens, is not just people growing food, but people doing it together and working together to say, oh, you're planting tomatoes, I'm planting zucchinis, is somebody else doing corn, and you mix and match and you share and you work out how to supply together. And very often community gardens go with communal cooking, and people come together. I'm not a particularly good gardener, but one of my very good friends down the road is, and he comes up with this massive oversupply of pumpkins, and so we come together and we make huge batches of pumpkin soup and we share that out, or we make massive batches of tomato sauce that we share out to people. And you build these connections, these democratic processes through those conversations. But obviously it also goes for transport, things like walking school buses that are cropping up around a lot of cities, or shared transport facilities for last mile between not particularly good public transport infrastructure and people's homes. For instance, people, particularly at moments like this with the pandemic, people doing shopping trips for each other and supplying each other when you can't necessarily all go out. And I see it very much in activism as well. I think the activism of things like the school strike that my younger kids heavily involved in is very much that process of of reinventing democratic systems as well, and saying, well, we're going to start just doing things and take decisions into our own hands. And then there's local planning. There's all sorts of participatory budgeting stuff that's going on. People coming together to set up little citizens' assemblies in their own communities and do things that as they want to do them, and make decisions together to determine their own future. And that starts to feed its way up. And this is the really interesting thing, is that you start to see things like the Voices for Indi, where a participatory democratic process has developed a set of priorities and of values where they can select a candidate and support that candidate and get them elected to the federal parliament. And you start to see it, certainly here in Canberra, where I started, what I was saying is that, the community is demanding more of a say in the planning that goes on in this city. So you see the parliament, the Legislative Assembly here, being forced to engage with that, being forced to set up participatory planning processes in suburbs to enable the community in particular suburbs to say, okay, well, we want this kind of development. We don't want that kind of development. This is how we want it to happen. And so through growing these systems at the grassroots, you don't even necessarily need to completely replace the other systems. What you need to do is that growth can change the design of the higher levels of the ecosystem. And it can change the norms of operation. It can change the common sense very, very quickly, which, as I said, I think is changing already. And as it changes the common sense, it begins to influence the institutions, and they change shape to match the demands. And through that, I really firmly believe that we can start to shift this system onto quite a different way of operating, onto a way that appreciates deliberation rather than only valuing adversarialism in politics, which appreciates the fact that when you get people together around a table and you start not from a position of this is what I demand and this is what you demand and where are we going to get to, but starts from a position of this is where I'm coming from and this is where I think we should go to, and these are the ideas that underpin that, and I want to hear from you and I want to hear from others around the table, and together you can actually find creative solutions that nobody had thought of in the first place and that are going to find their in a better way of living together that nobody had necessarily thought of. And just realizing I've been rabbiting on for half an hour now. I should probably stop and take questions. But yeah, I hope that's given you the idea that even in this moment of crisis, there's an extraordinary opportunity for hope. And if we seize that, we have to seize it with this very deep appreciation for diversity, for interdependence, and for the meaning of democracy that comes from that.
Thank you, Tim. That was wonderful. Everybody hopefully is on mute, so I guess if we want to talk, we've got to unmute ourselves. Tim, as the convener, I'll have the option of the first question, I guess. What do you think a small group such as ours should do?
Keep at it.
Keep at it.
And find, I guess I would find the ways that that your conversations can lead to practicalities. And I think that's the really interesting space at the moment, is that we're in a place, I think, where our politics just isn't responding to so many of the things that people feel they want and need, but our communities are responding, and there's a great deal of demand. And I'm sure many of you are involved, not just in conversations like this, but in many other conversations and many other things in your communities, and work out how to really get those democratic processes in those conversations bubbling up into different ways of doing things, into different ways of decision making, into the practicalities that you can do in your communities, the things that you can gently do to just shift little parts of the puzzle, and in such a way that it'll affect the whole as it develops.
Thank you. Someone else got a question. Oh, Greg Barnes. Unmute yourself, Greg.
Thanks, Rob. Lou Cook and I went to a Zoom meeting last night, didn't we, Zoom? Didn't we, Lou? Zorro. And it was the Extinction Rebellion. And there were 68 participants that were there, including Paul Gilding and a Jane lady who was a psychologist or psychiatrist, and Roger Hallam, who is you may have heard of him, but I think he's a professional ratbag and activist. And they were saying the time now, our tactics should be that we should actually tell the truth with regard to climate change, because we're apparently the science are always telling us to tone it down a bit. In fact, we're heading for 3 or 4 degrees, and we should actually tell it the way it is. And fear does move us, like with regard to smoking. That happens, and he was saying that one death is a tragedy, but 1 million deaths is a statistic. You probably heard that before.
Yeah.
And so they use the example of this kid dead on the beach that was when all this mass migration over to Europe, and there's this little kid left on that had a great impact. So, and then Roger Hallam came on, a professional activist. He said, we've been led in the path by crap ideas, such as they used to tell us that information can be separated from emotions.
Right.
He said, that's a rubbish.
Yep.
Tell me if I'm going on too long. He said, you'll get more action by being emotional. he gave the point of view, gave the story that how he went into King's College with a whole heap of other people, and because he was demonstrating about something or other, and he threw a bit of red paint around and got thousands of dollars worth of damage. He must have gone to jail for this. This is what he's saying. And the boss guy, the headmaster or whoever it was, came down and he said, "Roger, you have now shut down the conversation." And Roger said, "Actually, you haven't spoken to me for 4 months until today." So this is the sort of stuff that's out there now. And he's saying that you've got to make your arguments specific and personal. Tell them how your sister's going to get raped if this, and people are going to be left dead in the gutter because of the violence that will happen when climate change hits hard. And should you ever be interviewed by a journalist, he says, never answer their questions. Tell them what you want to tell them. So I'll stop now and I'll go on to mute.
Do you have a question?
I agree with a lot of that, although not necessarily absolutely all. Certainly that very last point, never answer a journalist question, tell them what you want to say. That's as long as you acknowledge the question, otherwise you just sound like you're being rude. I'm a very, very firm believer in telling the truth, absolutely. And what I guess I'm trying to do as well as the kind of the climate truth is draw in that democratic truth, that political truth that I think more and more people are coming to at the moment, is that our democratic systems are frankly not particularly democratic anymore. They were always quite weak and quite limited. If you ask an Aboriginal person how good is democracy in Australia, they will give you a very different answer from a white settler colonial person. And these things can change, and I think telling the truth about the fragility of democratic systems as well is something very important. And as I've spoken about and written about in the past, I feel like I grew up with that idea because my grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and I grew up very much on the understanding that we're very privileged at the moment, but that privilege can be taken away from us at a moment's notice. And so I think telling the truth absolutely about the climate and ecological crisis, telling the truth about the very dark genocidal history of this country, telling the truth about the state of our democratic systems, all of that is very, very important. The space where I differ from Roger Hallam and your telling of one of his points, which I've read from him in the past as well, is confronting people with the idea of the disaster that's coming to you personally when the climate collapses, and the talk of how dangerous it will be. Because actually I have quite a hopeful view. And I think the hopeful view is really, really important too. And I've had this conversation with Jane Morton, who was on that call quite a few times, that absolutely we need to tell the hard truth and we need to wake people up. But we also desperately need to give people hope that there's an alternative. And you need to do that at the same time. The dispute that Jane and Roger and others have, that the climate movement's been too focused on the hope, I think is absolutely right. But erasing the hope is equally problematic. When people lose hope, when people don't feel like there's a solution or that there's a path through, that's a particularly dangerous time, because they will just accept what's coming. So rather than say to people, it's going to get really, really dangerous when the climate shit starts hitting the fan, if you'll excuse the language, I actually think that it's really important for us to focus hard on the way we survive this is by building better ways of living together. And then turn that around and start to talk about actually, our current systems haven't been all that good. They've kept a lot of people down. They've kept a lot of people in their places. And they've kept us out of decision-making and out of better ways of doing things. And through watching this system collapse, we can build better. And so I think that's the big space where, and I think Extinction Rebellion do go into that space with the Citizens Assembly stuff. And I note that Mick's got a strong question in there on that. So should I just go straight into?
Yeah, we can. Mick can ask his question, and you can answer it, I guess.
Tim, first of all, thanks a lot for a really inspirational talk. It's great. You always take us somewhere new, I think. We we're a group of people who meet similar to Beneath the Wisteria here once a week, and we make a podcast called The Sustainable Hour. And we call it that we are in the tunnel, you know, when we meet here in Zoom in the digital world. And I think this Wednesday, we saw like a light at the end of the tunnel, a shining light of what it really means, the kind of solution that the citizens' assemblies represent. We interviewed a woman who works with something called Sortition Foundation, which is an international organization that's working on implementing the idea of using, you know, random selection of the community. You get 150 people together and you ask them some questions, and then the decisions that this assembly makes is actually relied on by council, by parliament, etc. So there was an example in France where it's happened just recently, and she gave some examples of what's happened in Ireland and so on. And I think to us who were listening to us, and I'll share the link to this interview, because we saw this big vision of what if we changed our society where everyone started working 4 days a week instead of 5, and used the 5th day on these processes of democracy directed towards the next citizen assembly in our local community, etc., etc. So instead of making it too long, my question is, should we be a lot more specific in trying to get, for instance, here at the next council election, trying to get candidates to begin to advocate for this? If I get elected, they could say, I will make sure that we get a citizen assembly in our municipality, or that kind of thing. Should we be more organized and structured about actually getting citizens assemblies on the agenda?
Yeah, absolutely. The one thing I would add to that is that we shouldn't be thinking about individual citizens assemblies as kind of the be all and end all, because very often when we're asking for, when we get very specific, we kind of say, okay, well, our demand is X, so I want to make sure that there's a citizens assembly on, on this particular process of development, or on this particular climate issue, or whatever. And what I would say is that we need to draw participatory democratic processes into everything. And we need to be making the demands all over the place that we should have multiple citizens assemblies, and we should do it ourselves. And I think there's two quite different ways of doing citizens assemblies, which, you know, practically are very similar, but can have, you know, can happen in quite different ways. So there's the top-down model where a government says, okay, we will listen to the community and we'll set up a citizens jury or an assembly, and we commit to implementing the solution. And the obvious fantastic examples of that are the Irish ones that people are talking about quite a lot, where the Irish national government set up a great big citizens assembly to discuss a whole lot of really important questions: climate action, abortion, equal marriage. And the citizens assemblies came to a particular conclusion. They published reports, and they then went to referenda and supported them. And that's how one of the more conservative Catholic countries in the world has legalized abortion and legalized gay marriage a hell of a lot faster than others. So that top-down is a really important way of doing things. But it's also really important to do things from the ground up, to just do stuff in the community, to build that practice, and to come together and say, okay, well, we want to discuss in this community how we can deal with, you know, a particular traffic snarl, or a particular, you know, the school drop-off chaos that's happening or something. And so we'll just host a meeting, and we'll make it a deliberative democratic meeting, and we'll bring people in to help facilitate and make it work well and all of that kind of thing. And you start to build up this practice, and you can do them quite open as well. You can do things like, you know, one of the things we're trying to set up here in Canberra is get a bit of funding for, okay, you know, say this community, this bunch of streets had $50,000 to spend on something for the community. Let's just get a bunch of people together, whoever wants to come and discuss, okay, what would we use that $50,000 on? So just the practice of democracy all over the place and bringing people together and learning how to have those conversations creatively together, I think is the crucial one. And making political demands of it where possible, absolutely.
Tim, Simon Kerr's got a question on UBI.
Is that me?
Simon Kerr.
Me.
Yeah, Simon Kerr's got a question on UBI, Universal Basic Income.
Hey everybody, Tim. So I'm just thinking around the broader issues of well, we know that we're in trouble with the climate issue, and we know that has spillover effects, and clearly I think most of us here are quite well attuned to the fact that we're going to run out of time, even if the best will in the world and every investment strategy and stuff was designed to change things. So we are going to run into serious climatic and ongoing ecological trouble. One of the things that stops people, of course, from actually responding is fear about the future, just unraveling. And that's fear, my family and so forth. So one of the things I think a lot about is how can we put in place forms of protection that will enable us to have serious conversations about moving to a decarbonized economy and all the other structural changes we need, at the same time giving people confidence that there is a future of jobs, there's a future of work, there's a future of economic protection. And I think UBI presents probably our best opportunity for this. And I'd be interested to see how you can, for your current thinking on this.
Yeah, as you know, I'm a supporter of universal basic income. I think it's a really important idea for so many reasons. Some practical reasons, like, you know, if we could just work less, then we'd have more time for these kinds of conversations, and a UBI can free that up. For moral reasons, frankly, the system, the welfare so-called system that we have, which is incredibly punitive and makes people jump through ridiculous hoops in order to just get the basics to survive when they can't find work, is just wrong. It's just fundamentally wrong, and we should not be doing that. But I also think there's, you know, in terms of the points that I was making right at the beginning about how our current system is a really extractive one. It's one where, you know, those in power see a resource and they want, and the system basically requires that you take a resource and you extract from it. Well, workers are one of those resources. And the way you ensure that you can continue to extract the value of somebody's labor from them is by absolutely entangling labor with their ability to survive. If you don't have a job, then we're going to make life as difficult for you as we possibly can to insist that you are too scared not to have a job. And everybody should be too scared not to have a job. And I think one of the beautiful things about UBI is it disentangles that and says, yes, we should all be working to some extent, but what that work is going to be different for different people. It might be gardening, it might be caring for each other, it might be parenting, it might be simply, you know, good relationships with people, maintaining good relationships with people in the community. That's an incredibly important thing that a lot of people do, that free labor of just helping people out and connecting people in the community. There's all sorts of ways of participating and constructively and helping each other. And UBI values that. UBI values that by saying that paid labor is absolutely not the be all and end all. It's an important part of the picture, it probably always will be, but we need to get beyond that into a different view of the world where society comes together to support, excuse me, comes together to support all of the members of society. We enable everybody to live, to have the basics that they need to survive, and we trust each other to participate in appropriate, constructive ways. And when you start to trust people, I find generally they will repay that trust. And when you don't trust people, when you tell them that you can't trust them, they repay that as well.
Thanks, Tim. Tim, Ern Mahari's got a question, I believe.
Sorry.
Did I
Oh
miss
no,
again?
looks like Val has. Val's got a question.
I just listened to all this, and there's a brick wall at every step of all of this wonderful stuff, Tim. Every time you just approach someone, it's a damn dead end. Our country at the moment isn't interested in people or welfare or anything at all. It's so sad and frustrating. And as a Scottish person, it just feels hopeless. You know, like you just can't get them to realise that people are worth, and your environment is worth so much to them. They don't seem to want to know.
And yet Scotland's changed so much, hasn't it?
It has, and they use that as an example for lots of wonderful things, but we don't want to go down that road because of that power thing.
So yeah, this is where I say I think we need to start sidestepping those blockages basically and start building ourselves, because those blockages, that's where I see this kind of, you know, the grabbing onto power that's happening at the moment, and these things on one level seeming like they're getting a lot worse is going on because those in power are losing control of the narrative. They're losing control of the common sense. And so yeah, I think that, you know, one of the issues that I have with a lot of progressive campaigning is that it keeps focusing on asking governments to do stuff when we know that those governments just aren't going to do it. I think running a campaign at the moment seeking to get our federal government to introduce a universal basic income would be insanity. There's absolutely no way they would do it. They have no interest in it. But talking about UBI and bringing these conversations forward and introducing more and more people to the ideas and seeing if we can do little things in local communities and getting little tests of it going where we support each other and do things. And the same with climate action. I can understand why Anthony Albanese came out this week and offered some kind of compromise to Morrison to try to get something going, but it's useless. It's absolutely useless. The idea that this government has any interest whatsoever in doing anything on climate change is lunacy. So don't even offer, just walk away and do something else. What can we do in our communities to start reducing our emissions, to start building new systems which are going to enable those emissions reductions to get bigger and to scale outwards and to be replicated all over the place? They're the kinds of things that we can be doing. And I have a lot of faith that most people do want to do these things. Mm. They're just not quite sure yet how.
But I mean, we're losing so much, like Adani, the mines. Every time you turn a corner, there's more and more native forest logging. Every day I'm signing petitions, like 4 or 5 a day, and trying to donate to everything under the sun to try and stop the Australia being just virtually burnt to a crisp or logged to a crisp. Or, I'm sorry, Rob, you copped all this last night. It's really, really hard, Tim.
It is. And look, I guess this is where my thinking kind of, I try to find, as I say, the hope in the chaos, is that from collapse comes opportunity and regrowth and regeneration. And there is so much also from the other side going on. If you look at, you know, one of the points I made in that Meangan piece is about regenerative farming, is that, you know, if you look at the capacity for people who really care to be able to come into really, really horribly degenerated and land, and in a remarkably short period of time, make it fertile again and bring the wild birds back. And that gives me hope that we can do the same kind of thing in politics. So we can take a terribly degenerated and devastated political environment, and with the right effort and seeding the right stuff and the right care at the grassroots level, we can cultivate a better way of doing things. And lots of people are doing it. And over time, hopefully fast enough, we'll win.
Thank you, Tim.
Thanks.
Tim, it's 12 o'clock. So is there anybody else got any other pressing question that like? Lou Cook's got one. Unmute yourself, Lou. Unmute yourself, Lou.
Done. Tim, do you support citizens-initiated referenda?
I do. as one of the parts of the picture. I think referenda, it's kind of like the adversarial nature of our politics can make referenda really problematic. And I know, for instance, a lot of my queer friends were really scared of the referendum on marriage equality because they felt that it would create this space where attacks on them could come out of the woodwork really hard, even harder than before. And I know a lot of them who were worried were delighted that actually it didn't happen that way. Somehow our country had matured enough that we were able to have that conversation maturely. I think referenda can be problematic. I think the problem with a referendum generally is that it's yes or no. And the kind of politics that I would like us to get us to is where we can come together and work on creative solutions. And that's where I think the Irish did it so brilliantly, is that they had their citizens' assembly to discuss issues, thrash things out, come and work out where all of the different arguments were coming from and put together a proposal to the Irish people. If they had simply put a referendum, but without that process, do you support decriminalising abortion? I think everybody in Ireland believes it would have failed. But because they went through that process of having the conversation, it passed with a 2/3 majority. So I think referenda are one important part of the process, but only if they go together with that really carefully designed process of conversation.
Thanks, Tim. I appreciate that. Any other pressing questions?
Yep, Rob.
Oh, Tom's got one.
Rob, it's probably more an observation or a suggestion rather than a question. We don't have a system of measurement that's identified against and I know the gold standard's gone, but we don't have a measurement system to compare with the monetary system. And I think until we get that register point, I think we're sort of flying blind. The other thing is solutions for government. You know, I'm about to put my hand up here in Geelong for the second time in several years to get back on council. I think they don't have solutions. We're currently working on investments down here on the Bellarine, upwards of 500 million, water waste energy to improve it. We can't get any traction, or it's difficult to get traction. They don't get it, God bless them. That's the challenge. Now, I'll digress very slightly. The word problem, I have a difficulty with the word problem. I think it's either a difficulty, a challenge, or an opportunity. And I think the more we use the word problem rather than opportunity, I think the more we put ourselves back into that hole. What was the other thing? Our ecological system, you know, we talk about the floods, the fires, all this sort of thing that happens. We measure it by crisis rather than by opportunity. And I think until we change the register point, you know, are we stewards or what was my thought? Are we stewards or owners? And I think if you go back to, you know, what's his name, Chief Seattle, you know, you go back to these people. We are stewards, and we've got this obsession with owning rather than being stewards of nature. You know, the nurture of nature.
Yeah, totally. Couldn't agree more.
That's resonated. I don't know whether it's resonated with you, Tim, or any of the others, but
yeah,
I struggle without this register point for us as stewards.
Yeah.
Criticism,
that's got to be at the heart of any path forward. In terms of the measurement, just briefly, there's a couple of really interesting ideas around. I don't know if you folks have come across Kate Rayworth's work on donut economics, where she talks about a really different way of measuring. And I think, you know, like I was saying about the kind of the linear nature of our politics and the adversarial, you know, this idea that we can boil everything in the world down to this one measure of GDP is just a nonsense. And I think there will never be a replacement for GDP as long as we're looking for one number. And that's the point that Rayworth made. To a good standard of living, and how are we doing at keeping our total within the ecological limits? And I think that's the kind of thing that we need to move to in terms of measurement. I
Tim?
have seen a specific suggestion for replacing the gold standard with some kind of ecological standard, where you try to get a measurement of the grand total of impacts on the environment, and you create a system of borrowing from the future, in a sense. But I think, again, its problem is that it tries to boil down all of these indicators to a single number, and I think that's fundamentally doomed.
Tim, we've got one last question from Tina Hanigan, so could we answer that one? We might end it. So, you there, Tina?
No, it's Graham here.
Oh, it's Graham. Sorry, Graham.
Yeah, no, I was just typing away a few comments there. Now, there's a lecturer at La Trobe in Warrnambool, Helen Scarborough. Are you familiar with her writings, Tim?
No, I'm not actually.
She's all about putting a value on the environment, and this idea that the environment's just there to be raped and pillaged because it has no values. So see if you can track down some of Helen Scarborough's works. I'll share them if I can find them. But similarly, I was involved with a campaign to stop Dennis Napthine putting a container terminal in the Western Port at Hastings because the Liberal government saw no value in having a Ramsar site. Why do we want migrating birds? We've got basically a swamp. We can drain it and turn it into a wonderful container port, which has been an idea around since the 1960s, when I think who was the Liberal Premier then?
Value. No?
No, before him.
Huh?
The fellow who got the shotgun through the...
Body.
Hamer, I think you're pushing for.
Hamer? No. Anyway.
You got a question, Graham?
Yes, and I don't actually have a question, except are you engaged with the younger generation? Because I see a certain demographic in this group, and we really need to get the message through the younger generation.
Yeah, look, I'm trying, absolutely. I've got teenage kids, and so I talk to folks in the school strike movement, and talk to folks at the various universities here in Canberra about various things. And I think there's a lot of interest. There's a lot of anger, frankly, amongst a lot of the younger generation that they've been shafted. And that's one of the reasons why I kind of try to come up with creative solutions that people can get involved in, that actually can make life better for people right now. And that's the way of doing things. Just briefly to pick up on your draining the swamp kind of idea, that's one of those interesting kind of the way our culture uses environmental metaphors in the negative, I think, is something that we really need to get through. Like Trump's draining the swamp. Our response has always been, hang on, wetlands are the most wonderful generative spaces, and that we're scared of the dark forest and the jungle and that kind of thing. We need to reclaim that kind of language, actually. That's
the mangroves there are a huge carbon sink.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
We are making headway, Tim. Years ago, they were called wastelands, not even swamps. So we're progressing very slowly.
Okay, folks, I think we might wrap that up here. So
Rob,
I'd like to...
Can I make one last little quick comment to Tim? If he wants an example of a referendum that didn't work, talk about Brexit.
Right, precisely.
Sorry. Thanks, Rob.
Okay. Okay, I think we'll wrap up, folks. So thank you very much, Tim. We'll give you an applause, but I applaud you. So that was a great effort. Thanks for coming along. It was wonderful.
Pleasure to talk to you.
Next month, on a Wednesday, we've got Professor Andrew Blakers from ANU who's going to talk about renewable energy and stuff like that. So he should be interesting. Good. So I'll send out a message about that. So
thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Rob.
Okay, thanks, Tim. I appreciate you coming along. It was great.
Pleasure.
Appreciate that. And thanks to all you other guys for turning up. That's wonderful. I appreciate it.